Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this lunchtime panel. My name is Magda Walter, and I'm going to be the moderator here. Just a few words about where I'm coming from. I'm a media consultant, former television journalist for American networks. My last job in journalism was Moscow bureau chief for NBC News in the late 90s. And I've been working as a media communications and media research consultant for the last 15 years. I'm currently a development advisor for the Baltic Center for Media Excellence in Riga. As you know, the panel will focus on the yet to be defined, and we hope our panelists will help us with this notion of fake news, disinformation, and propaganda, and we need to figure out which we're talking about when we're talking here, and how to, what kind of threats this phenomenon presents to our democracies, and what are democratic means to counteract or mitigate some of those corrosive effects on our democracies. I'd like to introduce our panel, and to my right is Jakub Czengama. Sorry if I spoke to him, if not to the microphone, who's the executive director of Justitia, a think tank in Copenhagen, right? Focusing on human rights and the rule of law. Jakub is a lawyer and has a degree on human rights and democracy. His most recent contribution to free speech was a successful campaign to abolish Denmark's blasphemy ban earlier this month. His work on free speech and human rights has been featured in multiple international media, including the English language, English language newspapers and periodicals such as The Washington Post, The Economist, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy. To my immediate left is Jon Kist, who is a EU diplomat and works for the East Strategic Communications Task Force in Brussels. On a secondment from the Danish Foreign Ministry, he is responsible for the team's Russian media analysis and oversees its outreach to Russian media and communications in the Russian language, including the official EU Russian language information website. Previously, John worked in academia, teaching Russia-related topics to university students and appearing as an independent commentator in Scandinavian media on topics of Russian affairs. He has also served as the Danish Foreign Ministry's official language Russian interpreter at high-level meetings. And he has a PhD degree in Russian language and literature. Dainius Radzevičius, who is next, is the chairman of the Lithuanian Journalists Union since 2003. He has an extensive media background, having worked as a journalist, presenter, and moderator in Lithuanian TV and radio, as well as a blogger. Between 2002 and 2010, he was a member of the Lithuanian National Commission for UNESCO, and since 2013, he's a member of the Lithuanian Radio and Television Commission. He also teaches journalism at the European Humanities University. So we have a number of incredibly visible and highly competent presenters, panelists, and what we would like to do, which will probably depart a little bit from the format of other panels, is we want to move away from formal opening remarks and presentations and make this more of a conversation, first among ourselves and later with the audience joining in. But we will, of course, follow a certain structure where we will seek to define the problem we're looking at and then move on to talking about remedies and some of the challenges that these remedies face. It's a massive issue, so obviously we will never be exhaustive in an hour and a half, but we hope that we can at least spark some discussion on some of the issues we're facing and the challenges we're facing. Once we finish with the panel and we turn to the audience, what we would like to invite you to do is both offer comments and questions. You don't have to limit yourself to questions only. I would like to ask that we try to keep the comments relatively short, so maybe around a minute if we could. Let me start by saying this. I've been working specifically in the range of various studies following what we might call Kremlin driven misinformation campaigns and information campaigns, and some would call it information warfare, although I don't use that term. But also studying the effects it has on various audiences and possible options to offer, especially Russian-speaking audiences, a greater plurality of voices in the media they consume. The whole term fake media, which we hear so much these days at just about every conference dedicated to human rights and free speech and journalism, is relatively new. We have started hearing it, interestingly, when it became an issue in the West, and especially in these two Anglo-Saxon democracies, so the UK in the context of the Brexit campaign, and in the US in the context of its presidential campaign, and also since then, since the election of the current president. However, this is not a new phenomenon. The term has now taken traction and has become a very fashionable topic of debate, but certainly Russia watchers have pointed out to some of the trends developing in Kremlin-controlled or state-owned media organizations aimed at moving certain narratives into the world to different audiences by different methods and in different languages. And it has particularly gotten traction in 2014 after the conflict in eastern Ukraine broke out, when we were confronted with what became truly known as hybrid warfare or information warfare between the two sides. I would like to start our discussion by asking each of the panelists to provide either their own definition of fake news, or whether they prefer to use a different term and use maybe specific examples they've experienced in their work, and give us this example, and then we'll move to talking about remedies. If I can ask Jakob to start.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to the organizers. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I'm a lawyer, and I think this is one of the problems, that there is no established definition of fake news, and it's been used extensively by governments, often in an extremely broad, vague, and ultimately illiberal way. We have numerous examples from Egypt to the Gambia. And the list goes on of countries that have used this to clamp down on independent media, imprison journalists, and so on. And I don't know that it's helpful to create a definition of fake news that then may be used by governments, because I think this will be one of my points, is that we should acknowledge that there is a problem with these campaigns of disinformation, of what we may label fake news, that it has real potential to harm democracy and free speech, which is part of democracy, but that some of the remedies that are being tabled now, also by democratic states, even by the European Union, where the Commission has talked about legislating in this area. We have a very draconian bill tabled in Germany. We have an even more draconian one in Italy. We have heard noises from Sweden and so on, that this of legal remedies against fake news and disinformation is a dangerous move. I may get to expand on that when we get more into that. So I mean, obviously we have important journalistic standards and ethics that are important, but I think, and I'll get into this more, I think ultimately we need to have, and we already see this, we have civil society organizations a lot, we have think tanks, we have universities, we have media themselves, we have social media companies that have now really said, okay, we acknowledge there's a problem here, because if we can no longer trust the news, or if we're given the impression that we can no longer trust the news, then there will, we'll have this information fatigue, and we'll ultimately no longer be able to trust our institutions. And without basic trust in institutions, you can't have a functioning democracy. But the remedies that to combat this should be based on the principles of the open society, and I think there are numerous ways to do this, both through technology, but ultimately I would say this, and I think that's a crucial point, that it's up to each one of us also to be a critical consumer of news, because if you're like me, you go to Facebook, for instance, and you read a story that confirms your outlook on the world, and then you may share it. So look, this confirms my worldview. That's a very human thing because we like to have our biases confirmed. But we shouldn't rush to share. What we should do is say, maybe I should be critical. Maybe maybe there are other sides to this story, and you should spend 5 or 10 minutes critically looking around, even if it's just through Google, to say, is this true, or is it just something that confirms my biases? And I think if we get to a point where we have a critical mass of people around the world, where we develop this culture of being a critical consumer of news, even if it's from mainstream media outlets, then I think that will be the most important instrument in this. So I'm not going to go into defining fake news, because I think that's already leading down a slippery slope.
Thanks, Jakob. We will get back to the remedies, of course. Just one moment, please forgive me for going back to housekeeping before I move to the next speaker. I just wanted you all to know, and this we know that, but for you in the audience, that this is being live streamed. So I'd like to welcome all those who are watching us around the world, and also quickly thank the governments who sponsored the event, the governments of Denmark, Lithuania, Poland, the US, Canada, France, Ukraine, Georgia, Sweden, Finland, Germany, the UK, Estonia, Latvia, and Norway. Thank you very much. And now we will move on to Jon.
Thank you very much, Magda. And also thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me as a representative of the East Stratcom Task Force, which is a part of the European Union's diplomatic service, the EAS in Brussels. We very much appreciate this opportunity to discuss an issue which we have been tasked to deal with a very strong mandate from the 28 heads of state and government in the European Union, who in March 2015 tasked our task force and the High Representative Mogherini to set up a unit that should push back on what we define as pro-Kremlin disinformation. Which leads me to an answer to your question, Magda, of terms and fake news. I certainly do not feel that I am the right person to define things, but what I can tell you is the vocabulary that we use in our work. And in that work, we certainly, and that goes very well hand in hand with what Jacob and Changama just said, rather than the term fake news, we use the term disinformation. One of the reasons is that fake news carries, as we see it, some problematic implications and connotations. It sounds like it's something that just needs to be debunked, and once debunked, then the record is set straight. That is, in our view, not the kind of problem we're facing. It also could suggest, the term fake news, that it is something like a fake rumor that's running around that also needs to be corrected, debunked, and then everything is fine. No, in our reading, the pro-Kremlin disinformation that we are tasked to address is a problem that has a more fundamental challenge. First of all, a challenge which seeks to question important institutions and important values in our societies, such as elections and more specifically media, the value and the importance of media. Now, if you repeat the word fake news enough times, then at one point you might run the risk that people, that your audience thinks that it is a problem that is so dominant and at the same time so universal that media as such and their credibility and their search for truth, that value becomes undermined. That is indeed how we read the kind of disinformation we are here to address, that we see a narrative which questions media. We see, for example, the Russian government's state-financed international outlet Russia Today, or RT, very systematically and also from a very early point using the term mainstream media in a very negative way, establishing, if you will, as we see it, an artificial kind of opposition with all media in one basket and then the pro-Kremlin media on the other side. I grew up in Denmark, as I think it was said, and growing up in Denmark, I remember even from when I was a young school boy how I realized that newspapers in Denmark had quite different points of view. There were conservative newspapers, social liberal, more Christian, more socialist. They certainly couldn't be put into one basket. And that is why we prefer to look at this, to use the term disinformation, also to thereby say that it is a strategic rather than a tactical problem. It is a problem that stems from the traditional concept of disinformation or disinformation in the Russian language context, which is indeed a strategic tool rather than a tactical tool. Our job is certainly not to, as I said, to define, which is, I saw this terrible thing here on my desk here. I think I'm going to give that to you, Magda, because you're the more correct person to hold this hammer. So as I said, I'm certainly not trying to define for others, but wanted to use this opportunity, and thank you to clarify why it is that we in the Strategic Communications Task Force in Brussels prefer the term disinformation over fake news. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jan. And now to Danius. Before we move to you, Danius, I just wanted to clarify that because in all the conversations that we're seeing and reading about and hearing in various fora, there are some differences about the definition, and also because, as you said, Jan, the word is used very flippantly, especially by, well, a lot of politicians, especially the President of the United States, but we don't want to operate in those kinds of emotional spheres. We would like to hear about, I as a journalist basically will see it as lies or stories that are not true, but I would like to hear what Danius as a journalist will say as well.
Thank you very much, Magda. Actually, this topic, propaganda issues, defamation issues, fake news issues, are very important for us as a for journalists organization, actually. But I would like to split, actually, two types of communication, which are common issue in Lithuania. And people, regular people, our audience, usually they say very clear, you are journalist or not. It means if you provide some more or less objective information, if you try to promote some values through your activity, seeking for truth, you are a journalist. If not, you are part of propaganda machine, working for interest groups and so on and so on. And people usually define the content like it's something like journalism and propaganda, advertisement, everything like the same shit. Oh, sorry. And for most of people, it's very problematic when you speak about some kind of journalism, which I officially define it as a journalism, but in real life, it looks for professionals like typical propaganda, typical not journalism. What I mean, we have a lot of content which are provided mostly not only in our country, but especially outside our country. Maybe you know we are surrounded by some countries which have less press freedom than Lithuania, and in some of countries, according Freedom House or Reporters Without Borders research, no press freedom at all. And sometimes we see like typical mainstream messages which are signed as a journalist's message, but it looks in the very beginning like typical propaganda and disinformation cases. I have one example actually, and sorry, it's related to our conference, and it's in Russian language, sorry also, because it was published news agency TASS. You know, news agency TASS. Yeah. Sometimes my colleagues from Russia were asking me, why do you don't use news agencies outside Lithuania, which are like in Russia or Belarus and some other countries like, and I told them, look, we have different standards, understanding of journalism. And first of all, if you speak of news, we need sources. Even news agency, if they provide some information, they need to put some sources, where, how it happens. If they speak about some persons, we need names of these persons. Not like some Lithuanian journalist, Russian journalist, Ukrainian journalist, but who concrete was speaking about something. We need to know. We also have very clear rules. If someone, some person or institution are criticized by journalists, it is very important to give them at least a chance to say at least a few words what they think about it. And I find that message, which was produced yesterday, the message originally sounds in Russian language. Союз журналистов Севастополя, Украина распространяет вымышленные новости про Крым в ОБСЕ. Yeah, we don't have translation, yeah? The message is related to, let's say, some evaluation of speech of colleagues from Ukraine about some facts about journalists and so on and so on, but in general speaking, was criticized colleagues from Ukraine, colleagues from Sevastopol about some issues. And I was trying to read this message, what concrete was saying by colleagues from Ukraine. What kind of disinformation, fake news, and so on and so on. No one fact. Even no name of this colleague from Ukraine, but was saying Ukrainian side, giving some misunderstanding, some fake news here during this conference. And all this message was based only on opinion of one person, Mr. Sergei Gorbachev. He was okay, he was speaking with personal opinion, was perfect, but if message has only one side of conflict, of some, I don't know, debates or something like that, according to our standards, we need to hear voices from both sides. And at least few facts. This kind of texts, which are officially sometimes in some places pronounced as a journalism, we use for our media literacy lessons for young people, for older generation. And if some people, especially older generation, are asking us, look, but we can read message even if it's include position only of one person, it's like very normal issue. I said, yes, during Soviet times it was okay, but not anymore. And we provide a lot of activities nowadays dealing with audience and speaking about very simple issues, about very basic issues. How you can split journalism from propaganda issues. And from my point of view, I would like to say very few remarks. We need to define not only fake news, maybe, but also the quality of journalism, including true sources, different positions and so on and so on. Thank you very much.
Actually, thank you for that last comment, because I find a lot of times in various professional fora, people will use the term fake news to basically define bad journalism. So not properly sourced journalism or inaccurate information or often secondary repetition of information from agencies or aggregate sites without really fact-checking. So there's a lot of lazy, sloppy journalism going on as well. But probably none of us would want to call that fake news because, well, there's always been good and bad journalism, and some would argue that standards are falling as a result of digitization and collapsing of business models of journalism all over the world. I'd like to move now, but if we could try and speak for just a little less time on some of the remedies that we feel that within democratic societies and within democratic rules we can either adopt or not adopt. And I know certainly that the gentlemen to my left have a number of examples of their activities to talk about. And I also know that Jakob has some concerns about some remedies that are being proposed that he already signaled in his initial comments. So we'll go back to Jakob, if I may.
Yeah, thank you. I think we also have to have a historical awareness that this, you mentioned that this has been a problem. It's not completely a new thing, but even if we go further back in time, take someone like Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the American Declaration of Independence. He said that he'd rather have newspapers without a government than a government without newspapers. But when he became president, he wrote a letter to one of his friends saying that nothing that you read in the newspapers today can be trusted. So this was a period in the time of America where there was a lot of polarization and a lot of attacks against politicians and so on. And I think things turned out okay afterwards. George Orwell, perhaps one of the biggest champions of free speech and anti-totalitarian ideals during the 20th century, he wrote a great essay where he talked about newspapers in London. He said, I saw newspaper reports which did not bear any relation to the facts, not even the relationship which is implied in an ordinary lie. And I saw newspapers in London retailing these lies and eager intellectuals building emotional superstructures over events that had never happened. So this shows that it's not a new phenomenon, and it's something that becomes especially crucial during volatile times, as are the times that we live in now. So that's one thing to keep in mind, especially when you're a democratic state, because I think there's a danger of basically mimicking some of the measures that, for instance, Russia would adopt, where you've seen people being punished for instance, on social media saying that Crimea is part of the Ukraine. How different is that from an Italian law that is being proposed, which says that it will be a crime to disseminate fake, exaggerated, or tendentious news regarding data or facts that are manifestly false or unproven. I mean, that's also a very broad and vague definition. And also, I think it's crucial to look at the international human rights standards. There are limits to free speech in international human rights law, but there's no specific carve-out for false or fake news. If you look at, for instance, Article 19 in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and only on, I think it was on 3rd March, there was a joint statement by the OSCE media representative, by the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, by the OAS media representative, and also the one under the African system, that all said that, according to international and also regional standards, these broad blanket bans against fake news are incompatible with human rights law. And we also have some decisions from the Human Rights Committee under the UN system that supports this. There's a pending case from the European Court of Human Rights that deals specifically with this, that we're still awaiting, but we have some cases that also supports that a broad ban against fake news would be incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights, and we have an advisory opinion from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So basically, if European democratic states push ahead with this, if the European Union does, then it raises serious issues about compatibility with international human rights law. And also, if you imagine in the EU, you have, let's say you had a directive on combating fake news and disinformation. Are you sure that Angela Merkel and Viktor Orban are going to be in agreement on what should constitute fake news and disinformation? I think there's a very big danger that would be implemented very, very differently, because inevitably it would be used for political gains. Or if you went to the US, the First Amendment would certainly protect against such laws. But if you ask Donald Trump, and say Hillary Clinton about what constitutes fake news, I doubt they would be in agreement either.
Or what to do about them, for that matter.
Yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in because, in all fairness, I wanted to point out this is such a tricky issue, especially when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia hybrid war or information war, because we also have a number of international press freedom organizations and human rights bodies that have criticized the government of Ukraine for banning Russian news outlets and channels. I actually would love to hear from somebody, if there is somebody in Ukraine who would later from the audience give us an argument why that is okay and why that is fits within the democratic context of freedom of speech. But it was the same thing that you cited, John, but in reverse. Very progressive, independent news channel Dost was cancelled in Ukraine for saying only for the fact that they mentioned Crimea as being part of Russia. So we see it from two sides. And I would like to move to John to talk about remedies within a democratic context and observing free speech and democratic principles.
Thank you very much, Magda. What I can do is I can describe briefly the three approaches that we in East Stratcom Task Force use in our action plan to fulfill the mandate we have received from the heads of state and government of the European Union to address the issue of pro-Kremlin disinformation. Now, I think the EU is a very diverse group of countries, as was also underlined by a speaker, and also very different views and very different approaches are available in the thinking in Brussels, which is, I think, well reflected in our work. Because we do three different things about this problem. The first thing we do, the first objective we have for our political masters is to improve the EU's communication about itself, which will, for example, mean that to clarify what a trade agreement between the European Union and Ukraine implies and what it does not imply. We thereby provide factual information about the European Union in a traditional government communications style, using videos, for example. We show students from Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, as an example, the Republic of Moldova, who have studied abroad in the European Union, come back to their countries and benefited from that relationship. So that is sort of in the international relations textbook, a sort of soft power remedy to clarify who you are, which is also, of course, something that we find necessary against the background of the disinformation about the European Union that we, for example, have seen in Ukraine, where we have seen, not in Ukraine, but in the way EU-Ukrainian relations have been covered. For example, EU has been talked about as sponsoring and financing concentration camps, unquote, in Ukraine, or similar stories, or that the EU-Ukrainian relationship should somehow imply that people would lose the right to speak Russian at home. Sort of these myths that are created, one way of countering them is, instead of talking about them, is to provide factual information. What does it actually mean for Ukraine to have a relationship with, a stronger relationship with the European Union? That's one way of doing it. Two other ways we address the issue is to support independent media. It's a very strong, if you will, liberal idea that a government should indeed be careful not to become anything like a Ministry of Truth. And that one point here is to strengthen the media. As I said in my first intervention, a part of the disinformation campaign we see it is to undermine the reputation of media. Now, how do you support media in not losing their reputation? You do it by supporting them with an arm's length, so that the European Union, for example, is a co-financer of news exchanges where independent media in the region, in the eastern neighborhood region, as we call it, the area to the east of the EU, can share stories that they produce for each other without the European Union playing a direct role or even indirect in that process. And the third way we address the issue of disinformation is to create awareness about the problem. Now, in order to create awareness around the problem, and I think all the journalists who are present here today will appreciate that in order to create awareness about a problem, you need examples. You can't only speak abstractly, as I did in my first intervention, and talk about disinformation and undermining values. That's abstract. You need some good examples. So what the East Stratcom Task Force does in our communication, and we are part of the communication unit, so that is our job, is to give examples of disinformation as it appears in pro-Kremlin media. We do that via a weekly newsletter and a website, via Twitter and on Facebook to reach audiences. We do not write long reports. We try to communicate every day to fulfill a mandate which is defined as creating awareness about the problem. So the aim is by no means to tell people to believe in this or that ideology or something similar. It is simply to set the record straight in the cases when something is talked about in a not truthful way, as an example of the fact that there is a disinformation campaign ongoing, partly directed against the European Union and its values and interests, and that it is not, it's still there. It hasn't stopped just because we've gotten used to it. Thank you.
Jan, I know you wanted to show us an example of some of the videos you produce. Would you like to do that now?
Maybe a little later. I think we should leave the...
For desert.
Yeah, maybe
Okay.
it's better, yes. Thank you.
Denis.
Yeah, actually, when we speak about challenges, actually, related to new type of old propaganda or fake news or all these things, we as a journalists, actually, we are caring about our audience, which will be future citizens who will vote for politicians and actually will have like very critical thinking. And it's most challenging issue because nowadays we see how many people we choose only one sources of information. They like one television, one newspaper, one news portal. And the main thing which are for us important actually to show for people how big diversity is in media field. And for some people it's really challenging sometimes because, for example, in small Lithuania we have more than 1,000 periodical newspaper and magazines. It's very difficult to choose which one are like the best in quality or better one. The same with television and radio stations. And most of people, they choose in a very simple way. For example, they choose one media which describe whole the world the same like this person are thinking about this. And usually also they choose because of languages. If older generation they speaks only, for example, Polish or Russian or one foreign language, they choose only one type of media. If a young generation has only English-speaking media, they has another type. And what for us, diversity is very important because we see how many people are living in one society, but actually we are living in small ghettos, in small split pieces of society. And we know very theoretically what does mean propaganda, fake news, and sometimes even we can say, I read this newspaper, I know it's not very good in quality, but I like this, just because I like this. And we have, I guess, the big challenge in many countries nowadays because of very economic issues. We have social groups which are very closed. We are, let's say, they cannot buy expensive newspapers and magazines and sources which costs. And sometimes we can speak about access to information very theoretically, but for example, if good newspaper, you need to pay more than 100 euros, sometimes even more for 1 year, and if you need to choose like 2 or 3 of them for people who are very poor, it's too difficult. And we need to speak also about access to information, not just theoretically speaking for people, look, you need to choose between many sources. No, you need to give them chance. And incomes sometimes, even in European Union countries, for some groups of society, it's biggest challenge actually. And we can speak about challenges from propaganda side, which are mostly, let's say, for free or let's say for less money. and looks sometimes very good in quality from technical side, I mean, and looks similar to journalism, and that's why we have a lot of debates nowadays how we can guarantee for our people access to quality content, not only on public broadcaster, but also on commercial media. And sometimes we have, like with colleagues jokes, if we have a weekend, we can choose between two types of televisions. One is showing old films with Rambo. Another one shows some films about Великая Отечественная война. It means some kind of war after World War II, which started in 1941. And people are really, they are sometimes shocked because of two different, let's say, positions when you speak about the same history, the same politicians. And for many people, it's very challenging to understand. We can speak about different opinions, different positions at the same time. Yeah, at the same event. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Danius. I think we would like to maybe just move to the last round for our panel, and just to stress, maybe to summarize, that what you're saying is primarily, I guess what Jon is talking about is deflecting certain mistaken messages in communications that your unit provides, in otherwise debunking certain false information, while you were talking, Danius, about informing and educating mainly the consumer, so the consumer can tell the difference between proper journalism and disinformation or lies, and know how to check things themselves. A final question that I would like to perhaps throw at the whole panel, and then we will move to comments from the audience, is there have been arguments made by certain governments that, and you mentioned this in a way in your comments, Jan, that some of the Russian government-sponsored narratives are parts of a larger strategy. Well, some will argue they're part of warfare, that what we're doing now in the 21st century, or what we're facing, is rather than active combat, we're facing information warfare. And some governments will defend actions such as proscribing certain news outlets or certain voices as part of a national security strategy or a defensive strategy. And I would like to know, especially from Jakob, but probably from others as well, what do you say to that? Because obviously whenever you talk about warfare, you're talking about suspending certain democratic freedoms anyway.
Well, there's obviously a difference between a country being in actual war and countries that may be in what you define as information warfare. If you're in actual war, you will typically have, you know, a larger latitude through national security to limit free speech, but not, you know, not a complete free hand. So you would still have to show the necessity of those remedies and why, if you limit journalists from accessing your territory, if you shut down news broadcasters, you would still have to show that, you know, why is this absolutely necessary, even if you're at war. I think, you know, the EU feels, I think, rightly, and a number of democratic states feels rightly challenged by campaigns by the Kremlin, including through disinformation and sort of attempts to sow doubts about the basic democratic infrastructure of liberal democracies. But the answer cannot be for liberal democracies to say then, we go, okay, in order to combat this, we're going to sacrifice the most important values. And I think it would be almost impossible to contain such a move, saying, you know, okay, we're going to prohibit fake news, we're going to shut down TV stations that we don't like, and so on. I think it would be almost impossible to limit it in a meaningful way. It would almost certainly spread and then be used by governments in other ways when they saw it as convenient for targeting other political opponents. And then you basically normalize the word war, use it as, oh, this is information warfare and you can do whatever. Then you basically take sort of a very narrow window of opportunity for limiting free speech in actual warfare, and then open and say, oh, well, we have this or that country or this or that group that seeks to destabilize our democratic institutions, and then we have to go ahead. This is basically, forgive me for my historical analogies, this is what happened during the French Revolution in 1794. It became capital punishment to spread false information and to mislead the public, and a lot of people's heads would roll under the guillotine, and I don't think, I'm not saying we're moving in that direction, but we shouldn't even be, taking small steps towards that. Thank you.
Thanks. What about the other panelists? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Coming from inside the European Union's diplomatic service, I certainly also do not like the word information war. The war term is I think, one we should avoid. That being said, I would, and I agree also with Jakob that it's sometimes used as a metaphor, but sometimes also by others used in a situation where they feel that information is being used to pursue aggressive political aims. Well, in that situation, I think there's another metaphor which is perhaps better, which would be the sort of a sports metaphor. I sometimes have the feeling that we're playing football, whereas there's another side which is playing football without rules, or rugby. Now, what do you do in a situation when you play according to rules, and you have a counterpart who does not observe the same set of rules as you observe? And what I mean by that, again, in order to be specific, is that a key component in disinformation, and certainly as we see it, a key component in that is a different and constitutes a difference between our government communication and the pro-Kremlin disinformation campaign, is that in the pro-Kremlin disinformation campaign we see an acceptance of not speaking the truth. And if that rule is broken, then what kind of situation are you in? You're certainly in a situation, as I said, where your counterpart is playing in accordance with another set of rules. Thank you.
Thanks.
Actually, it's not easy to say what the best tool would be, like fighting propaganda issues or fake news. But in our case, we in Lithuania have a very strange situation, maybe, because our media regulations are based on self-regulation system. Mm-hmm. And it was since 1996. And we had some debates, actually, with some politicians after 2014, to our self-regulation system, our media system, which are independent, how we can guarantee, let's say, assessed information in quality way and somehow fighting propaganda with specific tools or specific weapons. My answer was usually we don't need specific weapons, fighting propaganda. What we really need, we need to have very good quality journalism, fighting for public good as a journalism, because we mentioned for politicians since 1996, 1997, especially after economic crisis, media lost many journalists, and it was not prepared, let's say, to survive in such conditions. And after, when we got also a little bit more challenges from propaganda side, it was even more difficult for journalists. That's why our self-regulation system, our journalist associations, media organizations, we are dealing with media literacy projects, but also we are promoting for politicians, for governmental institutions, for society, open society with different voices, speaking with different voices is the best answer, because if you have one voice or many voices but the same, it's a bad thing, and that's why we promote diversity.
Thank you. You actually managed to sum up the list of some of the remedies very well. Thank you for mentioning self-regulation and allowing a diversity of voices to be heard. I'd like to move to the audience now, and I see one hand there and two hands over there. So can we start with the gentleman there, please? And if you could use the microphone. and introduce yourself.
Благодарю. Well, thank you very much. My name is Maxim Boykevich. I'm from the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, as you might imagine. You saw me yesterday here. I got two little questions because I'm not going to go into the, this, I'd say, information confrontation and make some political manifests here, as some of my, for instance, Ukrainian colleagues have just done. I think it's useless. That is why I would like to ask two concrete questions. First one would go to John Kist from Stratcom East. You've said pretty much many times that your aim is to detect, to define, and then disinformation, and then to inform about the very fact of existence of this disinformation in order to, I don't know, avoid it, or probably not to use it, or probably not to be believed, yes, by the audience. My question is, how do you define disinformation? What's the criteria? Is that a criteria of a fact which is being misused, or a pure lie, or a context? I'm asking because you've implied, for instance, Russian Today many times today, saying that this is a state-financed organization which apparently is using disinformation as its sort of information tool. The thing is that a few months back, as far as I recall, the British media regulator called Ofcom made a specific investigation on both RT and Sputnik in the UK. As far as I know, the Ofcom did not find a single, I repeat, a single evidence of a disinformation from both RT and Sputnik in the UK. That's why I'm asking whether or not you are implying to an information as a disinformation using a criteria of a context or a fact. That's first thing. And, well, second one, it's been for the first time in the history of the European Union since its creation and since the Lisbon Treaty was signed in 2011, as far as I remember, when a specific structure aimed at countering whatever information source might be perceived as a hostile or disinformative in the history of the European Union and under the chapeau of External Action Service. For us, it was indeed a shock, because in Russia, for the time being, we do not have any specific structure which might aim at finding intentional disinformation coming from Western information sources within Russia. We do have more than 600 TV channels, specifically foreign TV channels, broadcasting in Russia, a few hundred newspapers, and dozens of hundreds of foreign-financed, both state-financed and private-financed internet media sources, which are operating absolutely freely.
So sorry, what is the question, sir?
The question is the criteria of defining disinformation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. As I already said in one of my first, and I think it was my first intervention, also in the second, there are different ways of looking at this. One is, and also underlined, that the work that we do is certainly not aimed at telling people to believe in a certain ideology. We're also not a debunking office, so we're not a press office that sort of where the job ends when you have debunked the story. Our mandate is quite clear. It focuses on creating awareness of the fact that there is a disinformation campaign, its methods, its nature, how it works. In that process, we have identified certainly different kinds of or types of disinformation, some of which might be not true, some of which might be outright misrepresentation of reality, but also certain cases when something is attributed to a wrong source, or cases when some sort of a half-truth is seen as taken and then developed into a story that is here. Again, usually not to pursue a certain, not aiming specifically at convincing a counterpart that, for example, to agree with a certain policy or not, but to undermine some ideas. I think I mentioned, and you bring up Russia today, and I will sort of reinforce what I said regarding the one thing I said about Russia today, regarding namely the systematic use of the opposition mainstream media versus, well, implying Russia today and similar sources. That, for example, is the construction of a disinformation narrative, as I try to say, in the sense that it establishes an artificial narrative, which is that there is that all media that are not do not belong to the line that Russia today represents sort of belong to one basket, and the mainstream media are one, and then Russia today is another. That's an example of a twisting of things, which again, as I said, aims rather at convincing you that a certain government, for example, policy is right. It aims at questioning the value of media and aims at implying that people should not believe media in general. In that respect, you could even say that Russia today somehow, in an ironic way, leads by example by sort of being often quite clearly very biased and then thereby also showing that that's perfectly okay to do. Thank you.
With the two hands, please.
Yeah, my hand. Thank you so much. Jon, sorry I addressed to you like that because we know each other for a pretty long time. Am I right that I understand you in such a way you cannot provide any...
Sorry, could you introduce yourself, please, sir?
Pardon me?
Can you please introduce yourself?
My name is Peter Fedorov. I am a member of the executive board of EBU and the member of the supervisory board of Euronews. For 8 years I worked at Euronews, so I know the practice of the Western media. Now I'm responsible for the foreign affairs of the Russian state television. Thank you. I have to do that without your remind. So, am I right, Jon, that I understand your position like that? You cannot provide any wrong fact reported by RT, but you don't agree with the judgment of these facts and with the commentary. In my understanding, if it's so, it's contradict to the basic rule of the Western media. They know that facts are sacred and commentary is free. Thank you.
Briefly, and then I will perhaps suggest that also colleagues intervene in this important discussion. One of the cases I think is worth recalling when we have seen different media that belong to the pro-Kremlin disinformation campaign, one of the narratives that is particularly problematic is the spread of very diverse stories explaining the downing of the tragic downing of MH17 over eastern Ukraine in July 2014. Here we have seen different media, including Russia Today, relaying these explanations or stories, or as the Russian will be, versi, different explanations which over time creates, each of which is in most cases not true, and which then in totality become a narrative which aims at confusing the audience and suggesting that there probably will never be any truth available about the downing of MH17. That's a good example of a case when we have seen untrue information being relayed, but again, rather than aiming at convincing or persuading the audience, that it has been focusing on suggesting that, through example, that we will probably never really know what really happened, thereby again undermining the trust in, for example, the investigation as we see it coming from that's an example that you've been asking for. Thank you.
If I could just jump in, excuse me for a moment. No, sir, you already asked your question. Thank you. May I jump in, even though as a moderator I probably shouldn't be answering questions, but I see my colleagues on the panel shying away from this one. If I understood the question correctly, there was an issue of commentary versus facts or news reporting. This is really a very important issue in this so-called post-truth era, because all of those of us who work with the traditional toolkit of legacy media, which Daniel spoke about, and know that there needs to be, in responsible products of journalists' work, there needs to be a very rigorous separation of facts and opinion. And one of the issues that we run into now, and that is not only a phenomenon of pro-Russian government narratives and news media, but also a very big problem in online discourse, is that the issue of facts and opinion is being blurred. And one of the things we train people to do in places that don't have those democratic principles established is to clearly label what is news reporting and what is opinion. And while, sir, you have a right to disagree with one of our panelists, but we don't necessarily need to be so demonstrative about it. But what I would argue is that facts are facts, and if somebody can come to the site of an accident or the site of a military exercise and look at numbers and establish certain facts, whether a fire broke out or somebody fell out of a window, those are facts, and those can't be changed, and if those are changed, they're lies. And opinions are a whole separate issue. I think that is one of the problems with some of the media that we're dealing with. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, my question was about very concrete cases, and it's very problematic. We are not court, and not commission of ethic issues. Yeah, but generally speaking, it's challenging to give an answer for colleagues who are asking for concrete cases if we have discussion about principles. And I would say, and we discuss about principles which are very important for us. For example, I mentioned many times, according to our standards of Lithuania, for example, if media are owned directly or not indirectly by government, in our case, it means your editorial independence is not enough to be, let's say, in the fair play for audience, because of pressure, because of influence of many, many issues. And even if you have small pieces of influence sometimes, which cannot be described as a disinformation at the moment, but it seems for us we need to speak about whole standards in the same time, not only about one or another concrete issue and one or another concrete story. It's also was mentioned narrative, which are very important for media. And I would say if media are using some specific narrative for some long period and they find some opinions which supports this and less facts about it, it's also a question of quality of media and sometimes also quality of propaganda. I would say a discussion for this case can be like a really big one, because we cannot describe at the moment 1 second or 1 minute of content as a bad or good one.
Thank you, and I know Jakob has one thing also to add, and if I could ask next the gentleman, sorry, no, behind you, there's somebody who had his hand up. Could I ask the gentleman in the white shirt there? No, next. Yes, but just a moment, I just want to give Jakob.
But this is also where it becomes difficult with my point about the law being a dangerous instrument. Let's take the example of when you had the whole affair about alleged Russian hacking, or at least through intermediaries hacking of the Democratic National Committee. And it was the opinion of the intelligence community in the United States that it was indeed Russia that had a role played in that. So on RT, you had there was a big interview with John McAfee, who was at one point a sort of a cyber software guru, started this company a long time ago and was an expert in cybersecurity. And he comes on and says, well, the Russians didn't do this. But of course, this guy is also someone who has an axe to grind with America, who has these kind of well-developed, from my point of view, conspiracy theories about the American government being after him. So is that a tendentious way to present something? You know, RT should obviously be free to use McAfee as a source, but if he's the only source, then you can understand why others would say, well, this is a very tendentious source. This is aimed at giving one specific message while not including a lot of evidence to the other side. But again, would you want to ban something like that just because you don't like the journalistic method? I would say that hopefully what should be the remedy to this is that you have a critical mass of citizens on the receiving end of such an interview that can say, well, wait a minute, okay, so this is an interview on RT with John McAfee, but this guy may have certain motives for saying what he does. I think that's the way, ideally, we should deal with these things.
Thank you, Jakob. I'm sorry, I'm just going to ask you, sir, just to hold on for 1 second, because there's a transition to be made to what somebody from the audience also pointed out to us about regulatory issues, because we're talking about legal versus regulatory. And this gentleman was commenting and alerted us to some inaccuracies about the statements regarding Ofcom and RT in the UK. So if you don't mind, sir, could you just clarify?
My name's Tim Dawson. I'm the president of the National Union of Journalists in Britain and Ireland. So I don't speak for Ofcom. I have no relationship with Ofcom. My understanding of what happened is that a complaint was made to Ofcom about a series of broadcasts that RT had made, and that the finding against that station was because of the lack of impartiality that they observed in their broadcasts. It wasn't that they made no judgment on the accuracy or otherwise, but the failure, for example, to allow space to put allegations to people against whom they were made to respond, and the amount of time allowed for people who had allegations made against them to respond being very shortened, being a matter of only 6 seconds in another report, was the nature of those complaints. The complaints are possible because broadcasting in the UK is regulated by the Office for Communications, a sort of one step removed government-appointed agency who enforce a set of rules which apply differently to different types of broadcasting, so that the highest level of regulation is on news and ensuring that that's impartial. As I understand it, the programmes against which the complaints were made were considered to be current affairs, which have slightly more relaxed rules, but the complaints were about the process of the journalism rather than the facts themselves.
Thank you very much for that clarification, and now I'll let you speak, sir.
All right, thank you. Dani Koruga, Chief of Media Section, OSCE Kosovo. I'd just like to go back to the point of media literacy and how we combat this phenomenon, as we're calling it, fake news, illicit reporting, and biased journalism. And I don't think it's the issue that we're passing judgment on, any of these news channels or medias, but rather we need to look at education reform and teach, especially young people, how to critically assess the information that they're receiving and make a decision for themselves. Is it contextual? Is it objective? Or is it biased? Is it illicit? Is it fake news? So it's not us making these decisions or passing judgment. It's enabling others to do this. And I know time is short, so I'll just be really quick and what we have done in our area of operation. And basically, we have tackled the issue twofold. One, we wanted to attack it really from a grassroots level. We had an initiative called Ponder, which is basically an ad hoc initiative where we have a number of workshops throughout Kosovo in many cities, from Pristina to Dragaš to Mitrovica, where we engaged the Serb, Bosnian, Bosniak, and Roma communities, and as well as throughout Kosovo, to engage them and teach them media literacy. So it's a very non-formal education program that we have been engaged in and will continue. And the second approach was a top-down approach, where we engaged the Ministry of Education, Science, and Technology and urged them to include media literacy in the education curricula. And that's an achievement that we have been able to gain early this year. Now, of course, as working with any institutions, you always have some hiccups with changes in staffing, and at times we have needed to resell our initiative, and we should not take it for granted because our peers here and this conference, we all think alike, but sometimes the interlocutors and the counterparts that we work with may not be as well aware of what is the best path forward. With that said, I just want to also thank Remzi Lani. I don't know if he's here from the Albanian Media Institute, because as a first step, what we did is take the book that they have produced 5 years ago on media literacy, which was in Albanian, and we have translated into the Serbian, Roma, and Turkish languages, and we now have it available for teaching in schools in our area of operation. And the next step is to engage teachers from various schools in Kosovo, a total of 14, to learn really how to teach media literacy as a cross-curriculum subject in schools, and pilot it over the next school year. And with some hope and goodwill from our interlocutors, we hope that this will be kind of a long-term process, but also something that I know our colleagues in Montenegro and some other places, I think in Macedonia, they're making some gains, have had some positive experience. But I really think that education reform is where we need to start. And I think our colleague here from Ukraine wanted to say something, but up to you.
Sorry, yes, I'll move to you, sir. I just wanted to say thank you for pointing out the way that the Western governments can support, and I assume OSCE is instrumental in it, programs that strengthen media literacy as one of the remedies within the context of a democratic system. Sorry, sir. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Alexei Panich, National Public Broadcasting Company of Ukraine. I would like to respond to the challenge of our distinguished moderator. I'll give you an argument for the ban of some of the Russian media in Ukraine. But to do this, I would start with a more general question. Once again, it's universal applicability of universal standards. It's not only the question for journalism. For example, all the worldwide Christian denominations faced the same question by the end of the 20th century, like Catholics, or even more importantly, Pentecostals. And they discovered, to their surprise, that if they try to apply their universal truth universally with no contextualization, in the best case, it doesn't work. In the worst case, your universal principles work not the way you want them to work. What does it mean for journalism? Just for example, if you have some property issue, we usually credit both sides with some pretense to at least some partial truth. So we give voice to both sides. That's a two opinions principle. But let's take the limit case with rape, with eyewitnesses, and we approach to this using this two voices, two opinions principle as a basic universal principle with no contextualization. And we're saying, okay, we interviewed the raped woman. She says it was rape. We interviewed the rapist. He says it was not a rape. And well, he is a minority. He is the only one who says so, but so what? We should respect the rights of minorities. So maybe it was a rape, maybe it was not. Nobody knows the truth. And in this case, trying to follow the principle you believe it's very basic, you undermine the more important principle. You actually claim that there is no truth, only opinions. So that if you get back to the beginning, if you apply your universal principles with no contextualization, it's a self-defeating strategy. Now about Ukraine. We greet all different opinions, but Russian media banned in Ukraine, they convey not just another or alternative opinion. It's an opinion that your identity, our identity as Ukrainian, doesn't exist. We do not exist as Ukrainians. We are either Ukrainian extremist fascist minority or Russians who mistakenly believe we are not Russians. It is out of the limits of toleration. Sorry, we can tolerate everything, but the discourse that does not tolerate us as an entity, This is the main basic principle of what is tolerable for us or what is not. The war between Russia and Ukraine is basically the war for identity. It's not the war of identities, it's the war for identity. The main question of this war is whether Ukrainian identity as distinct from Russian identity, whether it does exist. We claim it does, and we would not tolerate the opinion that there is no such identity at all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the comments. Did you want any of us to respond to that, or are you just responding to some of the discussion here? Are you asking a specific question, I mean?
Well, question is, would you agree that universal principles need contextualization? And what would mean contextualization in the specific case of Russian-Ukrainian contradiction, war, to be true?
Well, if you take the European Convention on Human Rights, to which Ukraine is a state party, it does allow for a certain margin of appreciation. So that does not mean you don't have to have the same media laws in Ukraine as you do in Denmark, but there's a limit to how far you can go. So if you adopt, like you said, blanket bans, and you say because there's been what you consider to be unacceptable content aired on one media station, that does not mean that you can say, well, because we don't like that in Ukraine, we can shut down the whole TV station, or saying, you know, or it's basically, if I may provoke you perhaps a little bit, the same approach that an Erdogan does in Turkey. You know, there's content that we don't like, so rather than going after whom we say has breached the law, we're just going to shut down everything, including all kinds of other contents that may not be problematic and in breach of the law. So there is, you know, free speech is a universal principle under human rights conventions, but that does not entail that the legal framework should be identical throughout the world nor throughout the Council of Europe. But these very blanket approaches, draconian approaches, are, in my view, very difficult to reconcile, even with the leeway that you can have the margin of appreciation, for instance, under Strasbourg case law.
And what if you perceive that the very security of your state is at stake?
I see your point, but I actually also made your point when I asked the issue of warfare and how the panelists see that. I just need to interrupt you because I was told we have to wrap up, and I'm very sorry to the people who didn't get to ask their first questions because I saw a number of hands up. So, as I said, this is a topic that we could go on for a while, but unfortunately we have to wrap up. I'd like to very much, once again, thank the panelists. Thank you for your attention, especially during a time of lunch and networking, for coming here. Thank you, the sponsor governments and OSCE, for providing us with this forum. And let's move on to the next one. Thank you very much, everybody.